I signed the papers on a Tuesday morning in March, and I remember thinking how strange it was that 43 years of marriage could end on a day that felt so ordinary. The sun was coming through the blinds in thin stripes. My lawyer was sitting across from me, her pen hovering, watching my face like she was waiting for me to come to my senses. "Irene," she said, "please, just let me negotiate." I smiled at her. I put the pen to the paper, and I signed. What nobody in that room knew, not my lawyer, not my husband, not the woman he'd been sleeping with for 3 years, was that I had already won. The signing was just the formality, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning because the beginning matters. It always does. My husband and I met when I was 24 years old at a church social in Dayton, Ohio. He was funny. He had this laugh that filled a whole room, and I fell for it completely. We got married 11 months later, bought a house in the suburbs, raised 2 children, built a life. 43 years. When people ask me what those years were like, I tell them they were real. The good parts were genuinely good. The bad parts were genuinely hard. We were not a perfect couple. But I believed we were a permanent one. He retired at 68. I had already stopped working at 63 because of my knees, and by then we had a rental property business we ran together. Nothing enormous, just 7 units across 3 properties we'd accumulated over the years. They were paid off. They generated income. It was comfortable. We were comfortable. I noticed something shift in him about 2 years after he retired. He started going to the gym at odd hours. He bought new clothes, not the kind I would have picked, younger looking, a little flashy. He got quieter at dinner. When I asked how his day was, he gave me answers that technically responded to the question, but revealed nothing. I told myself it was retirement adjustment. Lots of men go through something when the structure of work disappears. I told myself a lot of things. The night I found out, I wasn't looking for anything. I had picked up his phone to check the weather because mine was charging in the other room, and a message appeared on the screen before I could look away. I won't repeat what it said. I'll just tell you that there was no way to misread it. The name attached to it was a woman's name I'd never heard, Claudette, and from the message alone, I knew exactly who she was to him. I set the phone down on the counter, very carefully, like it was something fragile. I walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the backyard, at the garden I'd been tending for 20 years, and I stood there for a long time without making a sound. He came in from the garage about 10 minutes later. He looked at me. He looked at his phone on the counter. He knew immediately. I asked him how long. He said 3 years. 3 years. Our granddaughter had been born 3 years ago. I had held her in the hospital and cried with happiness. And at that same time, on some of those same days, he had been with this woman. I asked him if he wanted a divorce. He said he thought it might be time. Yes, I nodded. I told him I needed a few days before we discussed anything practical. He agreed. He went to stay at his brother's house that night, and I sat at my kitchen table alone in the quiet, and I started to think very carefully. I have a friend. I've known her since our kids were in school together, and her daughter is an attorney who handles family law and financial litigation. I called her the next morning before I called anyone else. I told her what happened and asked if I could meet with her daughter. Her daughter's name is Petra. She's in her early 40s, small, soft-spoken, and absolutely ruthless in the best possible way. I liked her immediately. I sat in her office and I laid out what I knew about our finances, the rental properties, the accounts, the income, how everything was structured. As I talked, Petra took notes and her expression stayed very neutral. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Has he ever handled any of the financial side without you?" I thought about it. For the last 2 years, he had started taking over the bookkeeping. He said he was bored in retirement and wanted something to do. I had been relieved, honestly. It freed up my time and I trusted him. I trusted him for 43 years. Petra asked if I had access to all the accounts. I said I thought so. She asked me to pull them up on my phone right then. We sat together for 2 hours going through everything I could access, and at the end of those 2 hours, Petra closed her notepad and looked at me very directly and said, "Irene, I think there may be money you don't know about." She explained it to me slowly and clearly. Over the past 24 months, the rental income deposits had been slightly but consistently lower than the lease amounts would suggest. Not dramatically, nothing that would make you panic if you weren't paying close attention, but enough, over time, to add up to a substantial sum that should have come into our joint account and didn't. Somewhere between $40,000 and $60,000, she estimated, maybe more. She said, "This is called skimming. It's very common when one spouse takes over finances and starts planning an exit." I sat with that for a moment. "He was planning this," I said. "It looks that way," she said. For a while, I thought about the new clothes, the gym, the quiet dinners, the way he had volunteered to take over the bookkeeping. He hadn't been adjusting to retirement. He had been building a door. Petra told me we had two options. We could go into the divorce proceedings aggressively right away, make demands, hire a forensic accountant, demand discovery. That would alert him immediately that we knew. Or, she said, we could wait. We could let him believe he had the advantage. We could let him come to the table thinking this would be easy, and while he thought that, we could document everything. "How long?" I asked. 3 months, she said. Maybe 4, long enough to build an airtight case. I asked her what I should do in the meantime. She said, "Be exactly who he expects you to be. Sad, cooperative, overwhelmed." That was the hardest instruction I've ever been given, and I followed it perfectly. Those months were strange to live through. He came back to the house. I let him come back, per Petra's advice, because leaving voluntarily can affect property claims, and we existed in the same space like two people in separate rooms of the same building. He was careful around me. Not kind, exactly, but careful. He felt guilty enough to be polite. He started talking about the divorce as if it were a practical matter to sort out, nothing personal. He said things like, "We should both be fair about this, and I want to make sure you're taken care of." That phrase, "I want to make sure you're taken care of," made something harden in me every single time I heard it, like I was a charity case. Like 43 years of my life was a debt he was settling. Claudette called the house once. I answered. She hung up. I wrote down the date and time. During those months, Petra and the forensic accountant she brought in, a quiet man named Mr. Bursing Whitmore, who wore the same gray sweater every time I saw him, went through everything. Bank records going back 5 years, the rental contracts, maintenance invoices, tax filings. What they found was worse than we initially thought. The skimming was real, and it had been going on for nearly 3 years. But there was something else. One of the properties, the duplex on Crescent Avenue, had been refinanced 18 months ago. My husband had signed for it using a power of attorney document I had signed years earlier for a different unrelated transaction. He had taken out a home equity line of credit against a property I co-owned without my knowledge and moved that money into an account in his name only. That was not bookkeeping. That was fraud. Petra called me the evening Mr. Whitmore confirmed it. Her voice was still calm, but there was a different quality underneath it. "This changes things significantly," she said. "How significantly?" I asked. "He's not just hiding money from a divorce," she said. "He committed financial fraud against you during the marriage. That's actionable. And it means that when you go into these proceedings, you're not just a spouse seeking equitable distribution, you're a victim of financial misconduct. The court sees those very differently." I asked her, "So what do we do?" She said, "Now we let him think he's winning." He came to me in the 5th month with a settlement proposal. His lawyer had drafted it. It was what I would call strategically generous on the surface. He offered me the house outright, a sum of money, and half of our joint savings. It looked reasonable if you didn't know what we knew. What it didn't include, any accounting for the refinancing of the Crescent Avenue property, any acknowledgement of the skimming, any mention of the account he'd been building in his name only. I read it at the kitchen table while he watched me. I made my face look like a woman reading something that felt fair and overwhelming at the same time. I asked a few soft questions. I said I needed time to look it over with my lawyer. He nodded. He seemed relaxed. He was so certain. I met with Petra the next morning and we finalized everything. 2 weeks later, we were in mediation. He came with his lawyer, a man I'll call stiff and expensive, and they sat across the table looking comfortable. Like this was a procedure they were going through to get to the part where they'd already won. Petra slid a document across the table. His lawyer picked it up, started reading. His face changed. My husband looked at his lawyer's face and said, "What is it?" His lawyer held up one finger, wait, and kept reading. What Petra had prepared was a complete forensic accounting report, a legal analysis of the unauthorized refinancing, documentation of the skimming, and a formal notice that we would be filing a fraud claim if the matter was not resolved appropriately in this proceeding. She had also, and this was the part I hadn't fully anticipated, included documentation showing that the account he'd built in his name only had been used partly to fund expenditures that appeared to be related to the relationship with Claudette. Dinners, a weekend trip, a piece of jewelry. The mediator, to her credit, kept her expression professional. My husband looked at me. For the first time in months, he really looked at me. And I think in that moment he understood that the woman he had assumed was sitting home quietly accepting things had not been doing that at all. I looked back at him. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. His lawyer asked for a recess. 40 minutes. During that 40 minutes, Petra and I sat in a small side room and I drank a cup of terrible coffee and didn't say much. She went over some notes. At one point, she looked up and said, "You're doing really well." I told her I just wanted it to be over. When we went back into the room, the energy had changed completely. His lawyer was now doing the talking. He was no longer comfortable. He was managing. There's a difference. He presented a revised position, more concessions. Still not what we wanted. Petra declined politely and presented our counteroffer. It took 3 more sessions, but what we arrived at in the end was this. I received the house, full clear title, no mortgage. I received my fair share of all the rental property income, including back payment for the amounts that had been skimmed, with interest. I received a structured settlement for the equity that had been taken from the Crescent Avenue property without my consent. And I received a larger portion of the joint savings than his original proposal had offered. The court considered the misconduct when weighing equitable distribution. He got less than he came in expecting, substantially less. And Claudette, who had presumably been looking forward to a certain future, found herself with a man who was asset poor, legally compromised, and increasingly difficult to be around, from what I heard later. I heard from my daughter, about 8 months after the divorce was finalized, that they had separated. Claudette had moved out. My daughter told me with a kind of satisfaction in her voice that I probably shouldn't have enjoyed, but I did, a little. I want to say something here that isn't about strategy or legal proceedings. Because people sometimes hear a story like this and they think the happy ending is the settlement, the money, the fact that he got what he deserved. And yes, there is satisfaction in that. I won't pretend otherwise. But the thing that actually changed my life was simpler than any of that. It was the 3 months I spent being exactly who Petra told me to be. Sitting across from a man who underestimated me completely, watching him feel comfortable and confident and safe while I quietly gathered every single thing I needed, and discovering in those months that I was not afraid. I had always been a little afraid of what life would look like without him. 43 years of building something together. It's terrifying to think about it disappearing. But sitting in those mediations, watching his lawyer's face change when Petra slid that document across the table, I didn't feel afraid. I felt like myself. I am 68 years old. I live in my house, which I have repainted twice since the divorce because I wanted to. I have a garden that I tend entirely according to my own preferences. I have dinner with my daughter and my grandchildren on Sundays. I have Petra's number in my phone, and I have told every woman I know to keep a copy of every financial document they have access to, in a place only they can reach. I don't talk about him much, but I want to say this one thing clearly for anyone who is sitting somewhere right now in a situation that feels like it has no good outcome. The woman who sat in my lawyer's office 4 years ago, stunned and hurt and completely in the dark about what her own husband had been doing. She made one good decision. She slowed down. She didn't react. She found the right person and she listened to her. Everything else followed from that. I know some of you will ask, don't you regret the years, the time? 43 years with someone who was capable of doing this? I spent a long time with that question, and what I arrived at is this: I don't regret my children, or my grandchildren, or the house I got to keep, or the garden that has been mine for 20 years. I don't regret the good years, because they were genuinely good and they were mine. What I regret is that I didn't pay closer attention. Not to him. To myself. To the small things I dismissed because I trusted someone else's version of our life more than I trusted my own instincts. My instincts were right the whole time. I just wasn't listening. I listen now. If you are in a long marriage and something feels wrong, please, before you do anything else, before you confront anyone or sign anything or agree to anything, talk to someone who knows how this works. Keep records. Understand what you own and what you've built. You do not need to be suspicious to be informed. You don't have to assume the worst to be prepared for it. 43 years of my life went into building what I had. I was not going to walk away from it with my head down because it made the process smoother for someone who had been lying to me for 3 years. I signed those papers with a smile, and I meant it. People ask me sometimes if I'm angry. Not about the divorce. They understand that part. They mean about the years. The 43 of them. Whether I look back and feel cheated out of something I can never get back. I've thought about that question more than I can count. Usually late at night when the house is quiet and it's just me and whatever is left of the day. And the honest answer is no, not anymore, because I've come to understand something about how life actually works, something that took me 68 years and one very hard season to finally see clearly. The choices we make don't disappear. They accumulate. They become the structure of who we are and what we're capable of when it matters. My husband spent years making small choices to deceive, to skim, to quietly build a door out of our life together while I stood in the kitchen making dinner. Each one of those choices was small. Each one felt, I imagine, manageable, justifiable. But they stacked up into something that defined him completely, and when everything came to light in that mediation room, there was nowhere for him to stand that wasn't built on what he had actually done. That's not punishment from the outside. That's just the weight of accumulated choices pressing down. And the same is true in the other direction. When I sat in Petra's office for the first time, I was stunned and hurt, and I genuinely didn't know what I was capable of. But I made one decent choice. I slowed down. I didn't react from pain. I found someone I trusted and I listened. And that one choice made every other choice possible. The 3 months of patience, the careful documentation, the ability to sit across from a man who was certain he had already won and show absolutely nothing on my face. None of that came from strategy alone. It came from having spent 68 years becoming someone who, when it counted, could hold herself together. That's what I want to say about intelligence and strength, because I think we misunderstand both. Intelligence isn't about knowing all the answers before you start. Petra knew things I didn't, and I was wise enough to use that. Strength isn't about not breaking. There were nights during those months when I cried in a way I hadn't cried since I was a young woman. What matters is what you do when the crying is done. Whether you get up the next morning and make the next right choice anyway. Irene, the woman in the story, is me. And I was not remarkable. I was not exceptional. I was just willing to be patient when everything in me wanted to react, willing to learn what I didn't know, and willing to believe that 43 years of my life were worth fighting for properly. That's all it took. The man who assumed I would be easy to manage underestimated exactly one thing: what person becomes after decades of showing up for a life they genuinely believed in. That kind of person doesn't fold quietly, not when she finally understands what she's dealing with. I live in my house. I tend my garden. I have dinner with my grandchildren on Sundays. Some endings are really beginnings. You just have to get through the hard part first.